IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi and I have with me my colleague Shambhavi Naik. We are going to discuss a very interesting development recently. Last week, the Union Cabinet cleared National Research Foundation Bill to be tabled in the Parliament, hopefully in this session. And this bill is expected to be a very significant reform in the way the research and development funding and then the structure is done in India and how the structure operates. And we're going to discuss, how the structure that is proposed, how it helps the ecosystem and how it can be improved. I mean, obviously, we don't have as many details because the draft of the bill is not out yet. But it would be nevertheless interesting to kind of have a broad understanding of, why we are taking this step and what can be done about it. So, a very warm welcome, Shambhavi.
Thank you, Saurabh, and hi everyone. Quite excited to speak about the National Research Foundation bill. Been closely following it since the first murmurings of the fact that we would have such an initiative started, I think back in 2017, when the HRD ministry first put out the idea that I heard of. Then in 2019, it was part of a budget speech that Nirmala Sitharaman gave, giving an outlay of 50,000 crores over 5 years. And I remember hearing 50,000 crore, I'm like, finally the Indian science moment here. I mean, I'm not saying that 50,000 crore rupees over 5 years is a huge amount, but we have been analyzing the budgets for the Department of Biotechnology, which is like a pet area for me, and every year looking at 2,000 crores or looking at the nice SERB initiative which was launched in 2008, the Science and Engineering Research Board, which was supposed to revamp science, gets 800 crores. It's like those numbers just look so minute, and then you compare that with 50,000 crores over 5 years and you suddenly feel that, hey, this is the infusion that Indian research requires. So quite excited to look at what the bill does. From what little we know, what we're going to discuss today is obviously, what more information is really required to actually make a good assessment of it. So, but Saurabh, what did you think when you first saw this?
Yeah, first of all, for our listeners, like a brief rundown of what this actually is. So the announcement is that, the bill would be obviously will create a body called National Research Foundation, which will have a legal status. And then it is proposed to be administered by the Department of Science and Technology, which is part of the Ministry of Science and Technology. And then the proposal is that it is going to have a governing board, which will have a prime minister and no less as the president of the foundation, and ministers of science and technology and education as the vice presidents. And then there is supposed to be a executive council, which would be headed by the principal scientific advisor to the government of India. So this is the broad proposed structure. And like what you asked, Shambhavi, that obviously it's a great step forward. It is a reform that I think has been long overdue. But as you said, that the devil is in the details, and we don't want to create a structure which does the opposite of what it is intended to do. So for example, right, it is National Research Foundation. This was again proposed, had a strong kind of push through the national education policy as well, in which I think the idea was that NRF is going to help build the capacities for research and development in universities and higher education institutes. So those things I think are something that, if tackled correctly, is going to really be beneficial. So for example, it is research foundation, right? It is not a science foundation or humanities foundation. So both of us have a science background, so we have a bias that research means science, means lab, it's pipetting, DNA, chemicals, all of that. But research is much more and more broad. So by that kind of a idea, I think it is a bit curious that they would, the government would propose that the Department of Science and Technology is the one that will be administratively responsible for NRF. So, for example, I would think that actually Ministry of Education might actually be a much better ministry, just because institutes of higher education anyway come under it. So if the aim is to promote research in those institutes, so housing kind of NRF in that would be, I think, a step forward. And because again, Ministry of Science and Technology is Ministry of Science and Technology, and they don't have, I think, the expertise to kind of assess the research proposals that come from either humanities or very non-hardcore science areas.
Yeah, it is quite curious, and I have to confess. I mean, when I first heard of the NRF, as I said very early on, a few years ago, my brain automatically assumed it's going to be science research, and that is my bias, right? I mean, it's confirmation bias for me as well, because for me, research is science. But I think the NEP did a really good job in defining what the NRF should be doing in the country, because they kind of said that no, there has to be language research. We have all of these archaeological and heritage sites which require a lot of research, and that is true, right? And I think it is excellent if the Indian government is thinking of this bigger, wide pool of research as something that is required in the country, right? So I think on that front, the NRF is a really good idea. I really don't know what it is doing in the DST. So when it was actually when it was talked about in the speech, in the budget speech, then they allocated 500 crores as a seed funding to the Principal Scientific Advisor's Office to actually set up the NRF. And this was a budget item that we have seen. Right. So this year in the budget, they seem to have moved. They allocated 2,000 crores for the NRF and moved it under DST. Now, under the DST, you obviously have the Science and Engineering Research Board, which kind of makes sense because it is the Science and Engineering Research Board, and hence that being housed under the Department of Science and Technology makes sense. My sense is that they perhaps thought that because the machinery to disburse research funding on such ground exists within the DST, therefore putting NRF also there just because it will have the required kind of expertise to met out the funds might be one of the administrative capacity to actually met out might be a reason for why they want to move. They moved it from the PS's office, which had originally got funding, to DST. I still don't agree with it, because I think it signals to that bias. Right? It signals to the bias of people like you and me who think that research is science. And I think the National Research Foundation's primary course should be to say that research is not just about science and doing lab work. And I think that is going to be very, very critical. And so I think for that purpose, building out that administrative capacity, again, you're also going from 800 crores to 10,000 crores. 800 crores to 10,000 crores, which is a huge jump. And so there is a need to build that capacity. So you can very well build that capacity within the Ministry of Education rather than trying to move it to DST.
Yeah. I mean, true. I mean, I think our listeners may be a bit, like, why are these two, so super excited about NRF and then the funding and all? But I think it is very important to kind of give context of what our performance is and how much India's needs in funding. So, for example, India's gross expenditure on research and development is only about 0.6 to 0.8% of GDP, which is very low when you compare that to, let's say, US is 3.6% of its GDP. China is 2.14%, and Israel is 4.9%. And again, given the humongous difference between the GDP of US, China, and India. So imagine how less 0.6% of India's GDP is, and how much 3.3% of US and about 2.1% of China's GDP is, right? So I think that just shows the scale of difference and how much we have to kind of, have to cover the ground. And I was thinking, Shambhavi, one more thing that, your points are well taken, right? I think maybe because it's easy to administer funds through a existing structure, then it might be better, but it might also be useful to kind of build their capacity afresh. Or maybe NRF approves funding at the very top level, and then it is disbursed by the Ministry of Science and Tech, which is still acceptable. But I think the decision should be independent of the ministry, just because, if I'm not wrong, a lot of guidelines and rules and regulations regarding how the research is to be done, what are the kind of benchmarks to be followed, what are the precautions have to be made, and then all the ethics committee and all of that, I think they all come under the Ministry of Science and Technology.
For science research, yes.
So there might be some conflict of interest as well.
Yeah,
Yes.
for science
So
research, yeah.
for the science research, I'm sure like it is somewhat similar for the non-science research. But so I would guess that that is also a problem, and that is something that I think should be addressed.
It should be. And I
And
think,
how about like
yeah,
yeah?
just
Sorry, go
adding
ahead.
on to that point on limited to science research, I have to say, because that's again my exposure, right? Current structures have lot of inbuilt issues. Right, delayed funding, for example, it is quite rampant. We know people who have not received salaries for 2 years, fellowships for like the consumables haven't come in. So it is time to think afresh of, and try and completely radically new solutions. Just building onto that old system, just putting in more money is not going to help if the money is not going to reach people on time. So that is in no ways going to help capacity, right? So I think having a completely radically new approach and then hopefully finding out innovative ways of fixing the old problems that exist might be a better way to.
Yeah, true. I think that's and hopefully I think once we have a firmer structure of the bill, I think we could have a much more
I mean, for example,
like a much better
you and
idea.
I differ on
Uh,
have different opinions on
yeah.
having the PM as the head of the council, right? Because for me, the PM will hardly have any time.
Do talk about that actually, Shambhavi.
So I mean, for me, it is. I mean, I agree that it is great. That it means that this is a topic that is deserving and getting attention. But will the PM actually have time to sit on a council and hear
Hmm.
and what would be their role? I mean, if they're going to be sending proxies most of the time, I would rather have someone from, say, the industry who has who has some skin in the game to be involved, who has seen ground level research issues to be part
Mhm.
of this.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
I think it's great just because, I mean, as you said, I mean, it does signal that there is a significant top level backing to increasing R&D in India. And I think that is something that, I mean, we are all quite familiar, at least the ones in the field. There is significant bureaucratic lethargy in the system as well. So if there is, like the presence of the PM and again, the two ministers, I think that just gives a sense of
Yeah.
urgency to the processes, and I think that should kind of like help to push things forward. At the same time, I think the proposed structure is that it is supposed to have representation from industry, academia, and a whole variety of players. But I think the responsibility factor is of the governing council and the executive council. And so, Shambhavi, I was curious. I mean, we'll follow up a bit and see that the structure of funding in India as well. I think when we talk about funding, we talk about public and private partnerships, right? Public investment and private investment. And India's kind of structure of public and private investment in R&Ds is significantly skewed. So if you see that in India, only 7% of R&D expenditure comes from institutes of higher education like universities, which are actually the ones who do basic research. And this is very low as compared to Australia at 31%, Mexico at 27, France 21, Germany 17, and US 13%. So that itself shows, like the focus on at least basic research, either structurally or through like the way we fund our programs is skewed. And at the same time, you talk about the share of private sector in the gross expenditure on R&D, India's GERD by private enterprise is about 41%, which is low as compared to South Korea's 79%, China at 78, US at 73, UK 68, and France 65. So I highlight that the contribution of public sector, right, which includes in India's case public companies, labs from the government, and the institutes of higher education, 52% of GERD in India is by the government, as compared to the 10% only in the US, 13 Germany, 15 China, and even on the higher side, Mexico is at 36%, but 52% is significant, which means that government is kind of holding a significant burden of this expenditure, while the private sector is not really pulling up its share as much. And why do you think that is, and what can be done about it?
Okay, lot to unpack there, Saurabh. Let's let's go to your first point. So, at some point of time, it seems that Indian research got disconnected from teaching. Right? We seem to have got these institutes of eminence and national importance, where a lot of the, and again, this is science, right? A lot of the science research is being carried out, and then we have all of these universities, state and central, which have undergrad and grad level courses where the scientists are mostly teaching and then obviously doing admin work, and research doesn't always come as a priority with their job, right? One of, I think this was rhetorically proven very well when the UGC, I think a few years ago, had this idea that for promotion all teachers had to have research publications, and what we saw was a mushrooming of predatory journals and these journals which take money and will publish papers, because it isn't a reflection of the caliber of the people who are doing the work. It is actually a reflection of the poor conditions under which they're doing this work, right? Teaching is not a easy job. It's an arduous job. You don't have enough research funding. If you don't have infrastructure to actually for science especially, you need all of these infrastructure. If you don't have access to that, then doing research is difficult. So as a result, what we saw is that a lot of these universities don't really do cutting edge research, right? We have research in the institutes of eminence, and therefore we see funding also being kind of skewed, right? So, for example, when Saurabh was set up, 65% of that money actually goes to IIT and a minuscule goes to state universities, which is, I think, the problem the NRF is trying to sort, according to the NEP's version of it, right? And what you need for that is institutional funding to build capacity in terms of infrastructure. Again, this is for science. So that is one problem. So we need more money in the university system, but in the form of more infrastructure and capex funding. The second question you raised was on the private sector is not a major contributor. And I think one of the reasons for that has also been the fact that a lot of the private sector in India is into manufacturing. We do a lot of biosim. Again, this is science, not even science, this is biotech that I'm talking about, right? A lot of the IP is abroad. And one of the way of creating indigenous IPs is obviously innovation and research in the country. But in biotech, for example, we can very easily see. So when we have made genetically modified seeds, we haven't really approved them. So when your policies don't actually support innovation, when innovation gets stifled because there is no clarity in policies, you have a problem. The second is funding by itself for startups, for example, is pretty low. I mean, we do have a lot of funds, but they give 50 lakhs, 30 lakhs, which is not enough to actually sustain somebody through the startup cycle. And the third, I think, is the fact that even the NRF speaks to it, that they say that I think 35 to 36,000 crores of this 50,000 crore outlay is going to come from the public sector. So, it's going to come from the private sector. So, I'm assuming they're saying that there is money out there somewhere. And my point of view on this was that if the private sector is willing to put in so much money, let them put it where they want for research. Don't ask them then to put into a centralized government program where you then make the calls on where it goes out. So clearly, if policy is an issue, if the government can actually get 36,000 crores to be invested by the private sector, just create incentives for them to figure out, for the private sector to figure out what they want to research and develop, right? Why would you want them to control that through a government program? So,
yeah, I mean, true. And I think there's one more kind of a highlight. As you said, right now, 50,000 crores, which has been committed, I think the government is saying that the government funding is only 14,000 crores. And rest, if it comes from private, I think I am also a bit more kind of pessimistic than you, because if there was money in the private sector to invest, they would have done it already. I just don't see unless this would be accompanied by some other reforms, which, you make kind of research by private sector easier. And as you said, that once you have a technology, then you don't allow the politics of the day or misinformation to hijack it and then actually go through with it. I think that might actually create some incentives for the companies to actually invest. But as of now, I'm actually looking forward to how this additional kind of 36,000 crore rupees from the private sector is going to be mobilized. Will this be part of CSR funds, or will their kind of a capex be counted towards this NRF, or will there be like a scope for PPP or like a public-private partnership? We don't know yet. And also, I think there have been some confusion on this regard, so we have to be cautious. But there was some kind of predictions that even this 14,000 crore rupees is not new money. It is something, for example, if there are already existing programs that are being funded by the government, let's say the semiconductor mission, the quantum mission, or other grants that the government gives for different fields of science. I mean, at least that's what we're talking about. Those will be subsumed in NRF, and that 14,000 crore is kind of that. But there has been this one kind of interview of the principal scientific advisor to a DD News, where he does say that this 14,000 crores is actually over and above the existing funding. So this is new funding. So if latter is the case, then that actually is quite promising, and it's something that I think is much needed. But if it is not, and it is kind of like accounting method, then I think we need a rethink on that. And I think, as we have highlighted already in our talk, that the R&D expenditure already is significantly low. So I think we have to invest more, and that is something that we cannot escape from.
Exactly. And we have to. I mean, we have to be a science leader. If India has to grow its economy, innovation has to happen indigenously. We cannot leave it out for others. So, yeah, let us hope that the NRF bill is constructive, that it lays out. I hope it lays out more than just the board. That is my biggest fear, that the NRF bill will say this is the board, this is constitutions, this is functions, this is the chairman time, this is when they will retire, this is how much funding they will get, this is how the vacancy look like, like the standard board stuff that a bill will have. And that would be it. And then they will say in functions, the rules and the regulations of the board will decide once this bill is notified. That is my biggest fear, that it will not do more than that. And we need the bill to do more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think having like a kind of a legislative backing to something like NRF gives it like credibility and importance. I mean, but at the same time, it has to have that power and authority to actually do stuff, and should not be something that, is just one other cog in the bureaucratic wheel, because the idea is to promote R&D and not maintain status quo, or worse, make things worse. So I mean, that's the time we have, and again, I look forward to talking with you again when the bill is notified, or at least there is our discussions in the parliament, so we have a much broader and much kind of a much broader idea of what the aim of the government is, and finer details of what exactly the structure is. So looking forward to that, and thanks a lot, Shambhavi.
Thanks, Saurabh. Thank you for listening, everyone.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.